Hey, it was me, Mia. Just Mia back then. I'd been a 22-year-old coder who'd traded freedom for family, hoping it mattered. Picture me with fair skin taut from restless nights, auburn hair, a frayed shroud over my shoulders, gray eyes dim behind round glasses. Worn sweaters and scuffed sneakers swallowed me as I lingered in Ashwood, a foggy smear of a town. I'd handed Clara and Henry $800 every month because they'd sworn they were broke, but Clara's sapphire ring flashed too bright for her faded cardigan. I'd wondered if that glint mocked their pleas, yet I'd brushed it off. I'd scraped by, counting coins, while my sister Sophia ruled a lavish world with Daniel. At 28, she shimmered with olive skin, wavy dark hair spilling like a storm, piercing blue eyes slicing through me. They'd burned cash on silk scarves and ski trips, borrowing $150 from me with a breezy, "I'll pay you back," that dissolved into nothing. One night, we'd huddled under the flickering bulb of our cramped dining room, a table sagging with stale bread and peas between us. Sophia's silver earrings danced in the light. She'd smirked, her voice dripping venom as she said, "No one loved a pauper, Mia." I'd jabbed my fork into the mush, throat tight, her words coiling around me like chains. You'd known that trap, hadn't you? That choking knot of family pulling you under? I'd clung to duty, convinced love demanded sacrifice, but it had started to taste like dust. Her perfume clogged the air, her tanned fingers twirling a wine glass I'd never touch. I'd kept my head low, gray eyes tracing every gleam of her excess. A slow smolder had sparked inside me, unnoticed, waiting. Her laugh sliced the quiet as she bragged about Paris, her voice bouncing off the peeling walls. Cliffhanger. My $800 had sprouted wings for her, hadn't it? Back then, my life had settled into a weary drone. I'd risen each dawn in Ashwood, fingers cramped over my laptop, racing deadlines my boss had etched with a curt, "No excuses, Mia." Sweat prickled my neck as I battled code, the clock's pulse a relentless drum. I'd clung to every dime, pockets near empty, while Sophia drained my cash like a tide she commanded. She'd snatched $150 one week, $400 the next, her promises of repayment fading like mist on glass. I'd propped up her dazzling ventures, her Paris trips taunting me from my phone, while I'd haggled for bruised apples at the market. It had been like pouring sand through my fingers, gone before I'd gripped it. My gray eyes had dulled, weighed by a duty I'd shouldered too long. You'd borne that yoke too, hadn't you? That silent strain of giving until you're bare? One evening, I'd stood in the kitchen, wrists deep in icy dishwater, soap stinging my nose. Sophia's voice had slipped through the walls, lilting and bold, weaving tales of Paris as her silver earrings jingled faintly. My sponge froze, suds dripping like melted frost. She'd spun dreams of gilded towers and velvet nights, each boast a spark under my skin. I'd pressed my lips tight, a bitter edge on my tongue. My chest nodded as her laughter rang out, bright and untouchable. It'd been a quiet fraying, a cord stretched thin, though I hadn't seen the break coming. Her words had swelled, painting her triumph in vivid strokes, a song I couldn't hum. I'd stared at the sink, the water still as my breath, feeling the ground shift beneath me. Her voice had climbed higher, a carefree chime in the gloom. Cliffhanger. Whose sweat had forged that shining path, I'd wondered, as my hands shook over the dish. One day, my fragile world split apart. I'd trudged home to Ashwood after a brutal shift, limbs heavy from wrestling code, the screen's glare still searing my eyes. I'd yearned for my room, a frail refuge built from years of grit, so I'd nudged the door open and froze. My haven had dissolved. A toy plane bed sprawled where my desk once stood, and there was Noah, Sophia's 5-year-old, a slight figure with tawny skin, black curls tumbling wild, dark eyes sparking with wonder. He'd gripped a crayon, etching rough spirals onto my wall, unaware of the theft he'd claimed. Clara had twisted her sapphire ring, lips pinched. Henry had shrugged, his tone blunt as he'd said, "He's here now, Mia. Take the sofa or go." My chest buckled, 2 years of giving frayed in a breath. I'd handed them every $800 check, a lifeline they'd clutched, only to brush me aside like crumbs from a table. You'd known that sting, hadn't you? That crack when trust shatters? I'd stepped back, stunned, fingers tightening around my bag, the air heavy with neglect's sour tang. Noah's crayon had danced, slashing red across the plaster, each stroke a mark of my erasure. Clara's gaze had slid away, Henry's boots scraping the floor, their coldness a lock I couldn't pick. I'd stood there, a reed bent in a gale, my gray eyes locked on the wreckage of my corner. It had been a cut too deep, delivered in scribbles and silence, a blow I hadn't braced for. My palms had stung from the strap's bite, my pulse thudding as I'd watched Noah tilt his head, his small voice piercing the stillness like a bell. His dark eyes had met mine, wide and guileless, asking a question I couldn't answer. Cliffhanger. "Where are you sleeping tonight, Aunt Mia?" he'd chirped as my grip tightened, the room spinning around me. That night, my trust began to crumble. I'd collapsed onto the sofa after they'd taken my room, sleep fleeing as my thoughts swirled like a storm-whipped tide. Why Noah? Why me? The questions had clawed at me, relentless, until midnight draped Ashwood in quiet. I'd stood, feet chilled on the bare planks, and slipped to Henry's desk, a dim nook cluttered with papers. My hands had rummaged through stubs and old bills, the soft scrape a whisper in the stillness, until I'd pulled out a bank statement. My breath had hitched, caught on the figures staring up at me. Thousands sat snug in their account, my $800 checks knitted into a secret stash. Clara's sapphire ring hadn't lied, it had signaled their ruse, and I'd been too dim to catch it. My blood surged, a bitter truth blooming in my chest. I'd fueled their sham, every dollar a stitch in their web, while they'd hoarded and I'd scraped. You'd felt that sting too, hadn't you? That burn when the veil lifts? My gray eyes had flared, scouring the page, each number a slap I couldn't dodge. I'd lingered there, a spark kindling in the dark, no longer their pawn, but not yet loose. The room had loomed, shadows curling at my ankles, the air stale with deceit. My fingers had quivered, clutching their greed and ink, my heart pounding as I'd traced my name etched in their gain. It had been a robbery cloaked as care, a trap I'd stumbled into, and the realization had steadied my resolve. A faint hum of a car had purred outside, unnoticed until the floorboards groaned behind me. I'd spun, pulse leaping as Sophia's stilettos tapped into the hush, her voice a sharp edge slicing the night. Her shadow had stretched tall, pinning me where I stood. Cliffhanger. "What's that in your hand, Mia?" she'd snapped, her eyes glinting in the gloom. Dawn cracked open and my restraint shattered. I'd confronted Clara and Henry in the kitchen, the bank statement crumpled in my grip, my voice trembling as I demanded, "You've stashed cash, so where's my $800? The words had burst free, rough and unpolished, fueled by a night of their deceit gnawing at me. Clara had twisted her sapphire ring, fingers fluttering like startled birds. Henry had slouched against the counter, his mutter clipped. Sophia needed it more. Needed it? For her silk scarves and moonlit jaunts? My stomach twisted and I'd roared, "I've poured my life into you!" My gray eyes had scorched their downcast faces, the air snapping with my anger. You'd known that fire too, hadn't you? That instant when patience breaks? I'd stood firm, a torch flaring against their chill, every $800 check a wound laid bare. The linoleum glistened under pale light, cups strewn like broken vows across the sink. Their flimsy excuses had frayed before me, but then I'd caught the echo of her heels outside. Sophia had burst in, olive skin ablaze with fury, wavy dark hair a tangled flood, blue eyes sharp as blades. She'd thrust a finger at me, her voice lashing out, "You're selfish, Mia. Noah deserved that room, not your tantrum." Her accusation had pierced, a jagged shard, twisting my sacrifice into guilt. My legs had quaked, fury clashing with shock, her words painting me the villain in their crooked tale. She'd spun their lies into my shame, and I'd glimpsed her then, a puppeteer tugging at my strings. The room had throbbed, thick with her scent and their silence, my breath ragged as I'd met her stare. She'd whirled away, stilettos striking the floor like sparks, her parting shot ringing in my ears. Her shadow had lingered, a dark promise in the morning haze. Cliffhanger. "You'll pay dearly for this," she'd flung over her shoulder, her threat a blade poised above me. At last, I'd seized my chance to break free. After Sophia's threat, I'd snagged a Riverton flat in secret, a fragile thread woven from hushed plans, my escape a quiet pulse driving me forward. Days had raced by in a fevered blur, my hands darting over keys to chase deadlines, bags packed in stolen moments, all while sidestepping Noah's gentle havoc. He'd lingered in my heart, a soft ache, his dark eyes gleaming with a trust I hadn't sought. I'd pressed on, a stream cutting through stone, every $800 I'd once surrendered now a shadow I'd shed. One night, I'd crouched over my laptop in Ashwood's faint glow, rushing a project, my job a brittle lifeline beneath my boss's scrutiny. The screen had flickered, a lone torch in the dusk, when Noah had slipped in, marker tight in his grip. Green lines had slashed across my work, a sudden spill erasing hours in an instant. I'd flinched at the mess, my throat locked, the deadline a looming storm. You'd known that dread too, hadn't you? That brink where all could fall? My gray eyes had widened, fingers stalling over the ruin as code faded into nothing. Noah had peered up, green smeared on his cheek, his innocence a pang I couldn't dodge. I'd swiped at the screen, my pulse hammering, but the crack had sunk too deep, severing my last hold. I'd meant to leave at dawn, this my final night, yet now my career teetered on a breath. The room had tightened, shadows coiling like vines, the air ripe with ink and strain. I'd steadied myself, will forging into steel, when Noah's voice had cut through, light as a leaf in the wind. My phone had jolted alive then, its buzz a harsh stab in the quiet, my boss's name glaring on the display. His call had loomed, a judge awaiting my fate. Cliffhanger. "Sorry, Aunt Mia," Noah had whispered, as that ring promised a storm I couldn't outrun. At last, I'd broken loose. I'd reached Riverton after that chaotic night, salvaged my job with a desperate fix, the ruined project a sour weight I'd carried to slip Ashwood's grasp. I'd severed the $800 cord to Clara and Henry, their calls dissolving into silence like ripples fading on a still pond. My new flat had loomed sparse, a skeleton of bed and laptop, walls humming with the promise of a clean slate. I'd dived into code, fingers threading a fresh pulse, each line a balm smoothing the scars they'd carved. Noah's dark eyes had lingered, a quiet guilt tugging at me, but I'd forged ahead, crafting a life from fragments. Weeks had rolled by, my gray eyes sharpening as mist peeled back from a cliff's edge, when Sophia's call had pierced the calm. Her voice had oozed through, slick and brittle. "We've hit rock bottom, Mia. Help us." She'd spun a yarn of collapse, her gilded world in ashes, and I'd felt a cold spark of triumph, crisp as a winter gust. Yet her words had snagged me, a faint hook grazing old sores, and I'd paused, finger poised over the screen. I'd cut the line, breath uneven, the room's hush folding around me like a shroud. She'd reaped this fall, not me, I'd reasoned, though the doubt had pulsed, a faint tremor under my will. Riverton had unfurled before me, a tapestry of new dawns, its amber dusk gilding my window in soft hues. I'd stood poised, no longer their tether, yet not wholly adrift. The air had stung with a fresh chill, my laptop's light a steady beat when my phone had flared again. Her name had blazed on the display, a second lash in the twilight. I'd stared at it, the weight of her plea clashing with my resolve, her message a sudden jolt in the stillness. Cliffhanger. "Help us, or you'll regret it," she'd texted, her words a snare tightening around my fragile peace. Sophia's regret hit like a barbed lash. I'd woken in Riverton to X-posts spilling across my screen, her lies slashing through, branding me a parasite who'd drained her life. My heart had raced, a staccato beat, as I'd skimmed her poison, each barb a needle pricking my fragile calm. She'd spun my flight into treachery, her tale a twisted thread casting me as her downfall. My gut had clenched, acid climbing my throat, when my boss had rung, his tone sharp. "Explain this, Mia." Clients wavered, my job flickering in her storm, and I'd scrambled to patch it, gray eyes flashing over replies, hands unsteady as I'd fought her tide. "You'd known that snare too, hadn't you? That grip when deceit binds you tight?" I'd battled on, a rower against a surging current, Sophia's venom a wave crashing over me. Her spite had sharpened, a fang glinting in her ruin, and I'd seen her aim, a ploy to yank me back to her ashes. The flat had darkened, rain tracing rivulets down the panes, my laptop's glow a thin shield in the fray. I'd steadied my breath, will a coal smoldering through the gloom, when I'd barely caught myself as the doorbell pierced the air, insistent and stark. I'd cracked the door, rain whipping the frame, and there had stood Noah, drenched, his tawny skin slick, black curls matted, dark eyes pleading through the downpour. A neighbor had rushed him over, her shout cutting the gale. "Sophia's vanished, left him behind." My chest had jolted, a raw pang tearing through, his frail form a call I couldn't refuse. The storm had roared, clawing at his worn jacket, Riverton's edges smudging in the deluge. I'd drawn him inside, the door thudding shut, my thoughts spinning as water pooled at our feet. His small hands had clung to me, a lifeline in the chaos. Cliffhanger. He'd trembled against me, a sparrow lost in the squall as Sophia's reach stretched darker still. That night, the storm had engulfed me. I'd pulled Noah in, his drenched body quivering as I'd draped a blanket over him, my hands hasty to warm his icy frame. Riverton's rain had hammered the glass, a fierce cadence as I'd fed him soup, his dark eyes easing with each swallow. Sophia's desertion had gouged a rift in me, a raw wound I'd sealed with purpose, and I'd dialed CPS, voice firm despite the pang. I'd swung to my laptop, fingers carving through her online shadow, digging up fraud and neglect, a knotted snare of her guilt. My gray eyes had sparked, keen as a blade in the dim, each tap a shield for him against her reach. You'd braved that crucible too, hadn't you? That forge where will turns molten. I'd battled for Noah, for my footing, for the shards of calm I'd grasped, a watchman in the tempest. Hours bled away, papers scattered in the flickering light, my frame sagging yet driven, chasing her sins through the dark. Noah had dozed, a tiny knot beneath the blanket, his breath a soft hum against the storm's howl. I'd lingered over him, a frail glow I'd sworn to tend, when the air grew heavy, a chill threading through. I'd heard a car screech moments before, footsteps pounded outside, bold and unyielding, and my heart had surged, a trapped hawk beating its wings. The door had shuddered under fierce blows, timber creaking like a strained bow, and Sophia's voice had torn through, wild and ragged, shredding the night's veil. I'd stood, knees wavering, the room swaying as her cries ripped the quiet apart. She'd stormed back for him, a maelstrom unleashed, her wrath a twin to the rain scourging the windows. My breath had snagged, fists clenching tight, the flat a crucible I hadn't chosen. Her fury had swelled, a tide crashing at my door. Cliffhanger. "Open this door, Mia!" she'd roared, her fists a thunderclap heralding war. The night had snapped at its seams. I'd met Sophia at the door, her olive skin stretched tight with fury, stilettos scarring the floor as she'd surged forward, howling, "Give him back!" I'd locked Noah close, his small heat a bulwark against her gale, and I'd bitten back, not this time. Her blue eyes had blazed, feral and unhinged, but I'd rooted myself, a rock hewn from her deceit's furnace. Riverton's rain had pummeled the panes, a fierce refrain, when, after my urgent call, CPS had rolled in with police, their lights slicing crimson and sapphire through the downpour. I'd shoved my evidence out, fraud and neglect pouring from my screen, a flood breaching her lies. Sophia had staggered, her scream a fractured wail as cuffs had clamped her wrists, her wrath crumbling into pleas. Noah had pressed against me, his dark eyes calm, a steady pulse threading us through the tumult. You'd savored that rush too, hadn't you? That jolt when right pin's wrong? I'd watched her hauled off, a squall subdued, the storm swallowing her cries. The officers had murmured assent, their queries brisk, my flat a stronghold still upright. Then Clara's call had slashed through, her voice glacial. "You're no daughter of ours." The sting had pierced, a frost-bitten dart through my ribs, snapping the last cord of their claim. I'd held Noah, his breath a warm whisper on my skin, my gray eyes tracking the rain's wild swirl outside. The room had hushed, thick with damp earth and defiance, my heart tolling a bittersweet chime of triumph and rupture. Sophia's fall had unshackled us, a yoke splintered, yet Clara's cut had etched a sharper scar, a loss I hadn't braced for. The night had steadied, shadows settling like dust, as I'd turned to Noah, his tiny grip firm in mine. I'd exhaled, the weight of victory and void mingling in my chest. Cliffhanger. We're done with you, Clara's words had rung in my ears, as I'd faced a dawn I couldn't yet name. The courtroom had risen like a forge of judgment. I'd taken the stand weeks after Sophia's fall, her blue eyes drilling into me, a cold stream beneath her prison garb. My voice had carved through, stripping her fraud and neglect bare, each syllable a blade shearing her mask away. The air had pulsed with strain, the judge's gavel a firm heartbeat, as I'd met her stare, my gray eyes resolute against her icy venom. She'd sat stiff, a relic cracked by her own collapse, her doom sealed when the verdict had crashed down, a stone-splitting fragile ice. Noah had waited nearby with a caseworker, his dark eyes clear of her taint, a tender light piercing his shadowed past. I'd breathed out, relief rising like vapor from a weary peak, yet the triumph had rung hollow, a faint echo on my lips. Clara and Henry had rung again, their tones cutting like sleet. "You've destroyed us, Mia." The jab had sunk deep, a barbed tendril coiling in my gut, and I'd felt the toll of my fight, my family lost to their greed's embers. You'd trod that tightrope too, hadn't you? That span where gain frays into grief? I'd left the stand, steps sure but spirit unmoored, the chamber's drone a muted wave lapping at me. Riverton's courthouse had stood austere, its walls stark as bone, my footfalls chiming a lone refrain down the corridor. The battle had closed, Sophia bound, Noah freed, yet the emptiness had grown, a hollow forged by their scorn. My glasses had misted, breath snagging on the bite of it, my hands loose of bonds I'd once held. I'd prevailed, but the cost had stripped me raw, a song shorn of harmony. The sky had hung heavy outside, drizzle poised to weep, and I'd halted, a figure etched in justice and isolation. Noah's new path had glimmered, a frail promise ahead, but I'd wavered, adrift. Cliffhanger. "We're done with you," Clara's echo had told in my mind, as I'd crossed into a rain-soaked haze. Months had spun a tender truce after the courtroom's tempest. After the papers cleared, I'd brought Noah home from Riverton's stern corridors, his small hand clasped in mine, a bond shaped by upheaval and trust. The flat softened, his drawings brightening its walls, vivid strokes igniting a child's boundless vision. I'd guided him through code amid laughter, his dark eyes flaring with awe, a spark rekindling my own faded gleam. My job had settled, deadlines easing into a gentler cadence, my gray eyes weaving logic across the screen, a lifeline I'd seized anew. Sophia's echo had dimmed, her sentence a whisper carried off, and Clara's cold wall had stood firm, a barrier I'd ceased to breach. I'd crafted a small galaxy, a duo's orbit, Noah's giggles a thread lacing my quiet hours. You'd claimed that haven too, hadn't you? That shelter born from wreckage? I'd walked him to school each morning, his backpack swaying, a bright flare cutting through Riverton's misty lanes. My glasses caught the sun, breath calm in the cool dawn, the sting of family a mark dulled by days. We'd forged a sanctuary, a pulse of faith, his voice patching the silence they'd torn. I'd watched him thrive, a shoot reaching for light, my chest blooming with an unexpected glow. The past had ebbed, a current retreating from the strand, and I'd risen stronger, a guardian eased of battle's strain. The flat pulsed with warmth, toys scattering its edges, my laptop a steady hum in the twilight. I'd grinned freely, a lightness unshackled from their pull, the horizon beyond our sill a tale yet to unfold. One night I'd tucked him in, his soft thanks brushing the air, and I'd lingered, the room bathed in a stillness I'd won. The phone jolted then, a shrill chord piercing the peace, an unknown number blinking in the glow. My heart skipped, a flicker troubling the stillness. Cliffhanger. I'd raised it, breath taut, as a stranger's voice broke through. "We need to talk about Noah."